Thank you. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's continuing legal education course on Oregon Stewardship Trusts. This is a new type of purpose trust passed in the 2019 state legislature that enables stewardship ownership of a business. My name is Nellie McAdams, and I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Agricultural Trust, or OAT, and I'm the Treasurer for the Agricultural Law section of the bar. I'm going to be your moderator today with the help from Andrea Kramer, who is OAT's Education Program Director. Our experts on the subject are Maria Schmidlkofer and June Wiyrick Flores, both shareholders at Schwab Williamson and Wyatt. Maria has been practicing estate planning for about 16 years and helps farmers and ranchers throughout Oregon with farm succession planning. June has been practicing estate planning for about over 25 years and helps family businesses in Oregon, Washington, and California with their succession planning. Maria and June will present for about 45 minutes, and then they'll take your questions for 15 minutes. You can enter your questions in the chat box as we go anytime. If there are any clarifying questions, I'll ask those of the presenters during the presentation, but I'll be saving the longer and more detailed questions until that end Q&A. We have a pending application for one general CLE credit for this event. So if you registered on the bar's website, I have all the information I need to submit your credit for your CLE. If you did not register on the bar's website and found this link otherwise, that's great. If you want CLE credit, just put your name and bar number in the chat box and I'll submit your registration. And if you're watching the recording, just reach out to me over email and I will submit that as well. So I'll put those instructions in the chat box. But with that, I will hand the mic over to our presenters.
Thanks, Nellie. Appreciate it. I will go
Thanks,
ahead
Nellie.
and share the screen here, and then we can just hop right in. So I'm Maria, and I work out of Schwabi's Salem office. And so, and then June works out of our Portland office, and we do a lot of farm succession planning. And so when the Oregon Stewardship Trusts came out 3 years ago now, it was something that we wanted to jump right on because it seemed to fit the bill pretty well. So with that, let's see here. June, you want to take it away?
Yeah, you want to advance to the next slide? So the Stewardship Trust is a new type of trust in Oregon. In other states, they're sometimes called a perpetual purpose trust or a non-charitable purpose trust. And the Stewardship Trust is different from a traditional revocable or irrevocable trust. In the traditional trust, the trustee manages and invests assets for the economic benefit of the named beneficiaries in the trust, and the trustee has a duty to those beneficiaries of the trust. In the Stewardship Trust, the duties of the fiduciaries are to manage the assets for the specified purpose in the trust. And it doesn't have to be for the economic advantage of the beneficiaries. The Stewardship Trust can be created without having specific identifiable beneficiaries, which is unlike traditional trust. The purpose of the trust can be broad, and it can include economic or non-economic purposes. For example, the purpose of the trust could be to preserve the land, to care for animals, to benefit the general community or specific aspects of a community, or even to reinvest the profits in the employees or employee benefit plans. A stewardship trust can hold all types of business entities and assets. So, it doesn't matter if it's a corporation, partnership, LLC, limited liability partnership, or even joint ventures. All of those can be owned within the stewardship trust. One thing to note is that if the stewardship trust is going to own shares in an S corporation, the stewardship trust still has to meet the qualifications to be a qualified subchapter S trust or an electing small business trust in order for the S corp to retain its status as an S corporation. So there's kind of a caveat with some of the provisions that we'll be talking about today, is that if the underlying asset is an S corp, some of the flexibility is diminished with the stewardship trust. The stewardship trust, the other advantage of the stewardship trust over kind of the traditional trust is that it can avoid the prudent investor rule. And even though we can include that in drafting in our kind of standard irrevocable trust, because the stewardship trust is designed by statute that the fiduciaries are to follow or invest the assets for the purpose of the trust, which is stated in the trust agreement. So if the purpose of the trust is to hold, maintain, and operate the farming or ranching business or whatever business is going to hold, then retaining those assets is complying with the purpose of the trust. And so the trustees or the fiduciaries can't be, aren't subject to that same standard where they have to have a broad investments and have diversified portfolio. So that's one of the significant advantages of using the stewardship trust, is that it's really everything is driven towards what the purpose of the trust is that is stated in the trust agreement. The stewardship trust has to have 5 different people as part of its fiduciaries, which we're going to go into detail. So there's a trustee, a trust enforcer, and then also a stewardship committee. And the stewardship committee has to be comprised of 3 different people. So that's how we get to the 5 persons who have to do that. Another option that's available with the stewardship trust that's not available with the irrevocable trust in Oregon is that with the stewardship trust, the settlor who's creating the trust can opt out of the rule against perpetuity. So the stewardship trust can go on for perpetuity. And we don't have that option with other irrevocable trusts in Oregon. The other kind of advantage, which we'll talk about a little bit more too, is that the stewardship trust is really flexible. Many of the provisions are default provisions, so it allows the settlor to decide on many different matters themselves. Marie, you want to go on to the next slide?
Right. So, and just to give you guys a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going here, we're going to get the legal requirements and who the players are in a stewardship trust out of the way first. And then the second half of this presentation will be going into the examples that we have personally done when this came up and it's fit the client's goals in the farm context. So the first question you would ask yourself is when does this come up, right? And it's when you have a farmer or rancher who's saying, I love the land. I want the land to continue as a farm forever and ever. That is usually when I start thinking, oh, maybe this is one of the options that we should look at for how to preserve the land forever. The other kind of ding, ding, ding in my brain when we're talking estate planning and we're trying to figure out what's a good method for them is if they don't have clear beneficiaries that they want to leave the farm to. So it's not your traditional concept of I'm going to give it all to the farm child and that person will continue farming it and then they'll give it to their kids and so on and so forth. We do lots of those plans. That's your traditional plan, right? And those have to end after a certain period of years because of the rule against perpetuities. So with this, it's more, they probably, or they could have beneficiaries, and it could be their own descendants, or it might be completely different beneficiaries like nieces and nephews or charities. And they don't have any family that they want to leave the farm to specifically, but they want to keep the farm a farm forever. So that's when we start thinking maybe a stewardship trust would be the right option for them if it fits the parameters of taxes and everything else that we have to talk about. The other thing that I'm always thinking about before I introduce the concept of maybe you should consider a stewardship trust for your farm or ranch is, and we ask this, I guess, with every business, right? Is your farm profitable? Because if they don't have a lot of other assets and the farm is not self-sustaining, it's going to be very difficult to keep a perpetual farm trust going. So that would be, if those things fit, that they really want the land to stay in farming and they don't have a specific beneficiary that they just want to give it to, and it's a profitable enterprise, at least at this point in time, then the stewardship trust could be a good option for them. Okay. So June?
So when should clients consider creating a stewardship trust? Is it something that they should create during their lifetime, or is it something that should go into effect when they pass away? And again, it really depends on what their overall goals are. But generally, if a client is interested in creating one during their lifetime, some of the advantages of doing that is that they can create a stewardship trust and then transfer ownership of some of the assets or a portion of the assets to the stewardship trust. And it gives them the ability to make sure that it's going to work the way that they want it to do, that the fiduciaries, 5 fiduciaries that they've named, are going to be able to work together and really just kind of test that plan. When we do that with clients who are creating who are creating the lifetime stewardship trust, we try to make it flexible so that the client, if things change or they want to, undo the stewardship trust, that they have the option to do that. One of the ways we can do that is by giving one of the beneficiaries, if there are beneficiaries, or an independent third party, what's called a limited power of appointment. It lets them direct the distribution of a trust when a person or a beneficiary dies. So it gives them the ability to kind of end the stewardship trust and have the assets distributed out to another person or entity, or even be sold. We can also, with clients who are making the gift of assets during their lifetime, we can give them control by creating his and her stewardship trust. So if the farm is owned by a husband and wife couple, then they can create separate stewardship trusts and retain ownership by having, or retain, not ownership, but retain some control by having voting units on the stewardship committee, making each other a beneficiary so that one of them is included on the stewardship committee or can get the economic benefit. So there's a lot of flexibility with doing that. If it's a testamentary stewardship trust, meaning that in their revocable trust or their will, there's provisions for creating this stewardship trust or funding it when the survivor passes away. One of the disadvantages of that is that they're not able to test it. So it's kind of, we're going to see how it works after they're gone, and we may not really have a lot of opportunity to fix any problems or to undo it if it's not working the way they intended. The other issue is the estate tax concerns with doing that. So if the clients are leaving their farming or ranching assets into the stewardship trust when they pass away, they're going to lose the ability to use Oregon's natural resource credit and or the new up to $15 million exemption for those assets that just, I think it goes into effect next month on that. So there are some estate tax disadvantages for them to have the assets go to a stewardship trust when they pass away.
Great. So when we decide a stewardship trust is the right thing to present to a client, we're also often talking about similar avenues that might accomplish their same intents. So other legal tricks and traps that we have, so to speak, that we can use to help them meet their goal of leaving the farm the way they want to. So June had just mentioned one of the biggest concerns when we're considering the stewardship trust is the Oregon estate tax, because it loses the options for the natural resource credit and the new estate farm exemption. So how I have been able to get around that is a couple ways. But one that often works in tandem with the stewardship trust when I'm planning for a death, that's going to create the stewardship trust and the farm's going to stay a farm, is we'll actually do, if it's a married couple, a spousal limited access trust, which is an irrevocable trust for the benefit of the spouse. So you can give your spouse your farm, and that person can use it for their life, and then it goes to the stewardship trust. And since it's a lifetime irrevocable transfer to your spouse, then it avoids all of the Oregon estate taxes at death. So a lot of times when I'm talking stewardship trust and they don't want to start it during life, then we're talking about, well, if you're married, what about this option to give it to your spouse in a special kind of irrevocable spousal trust? The other thing that we often talk about when we're talking about protecting the land, and Andrea and Nellie from Oregon Agricultural Trust are much better at speaking on this than myself, is we talk about, well, what if we just put an easement on the land and said that it has to stay a farm? And you'd work with somebody like Oregon Agricultural Trusts to figure out what that looks like and if this farm is suitable for that purpose. In some steward trusts I've done, that maybe they're not ready to put that easement on the land today or even require it, at death. But what a couple of people have done is they've said that if the steward trust ever had to end, so it wasn't profitable, there wasn't somebody to run it anymore, and it had to end and everything had to be sold and everything had to go away, then there are instructions in some of the trusts to say, make every effort to see if you can put an agricultural easement on this before you just sell it to a third party, because they never want it to go to development. And so the spousal trusts and the working lands conservation easements are two other really helpful tools when we're doing the planning for the stewardship trust. And June's going to talk about a couple other ones here. Let's see here. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. So June, did you want to talk about?
Yeah, and so these are, some of the other options that for clients to consider, as alternatives to the stewardship trust, or even including them as part of a stewardship trust. That's one of the nice things, is that it can be very flexible. Is that, creating multi-generational trusts that restrict the sale. I mean, that's ultimately what a stewardship trust is, but that can be done in other ways as well. The challenge with that is it's still subject to the Oregon rule against perpetuity. So again, that's a benefit that the stewardship trust has over the traditional dynasty trust. I have clients who have done the sale to a intentionally defective grantor trust during their lifetime. And basically what that means is they've created an irrevocable trust. And for income tax purposes, they're still treated as the owner of the irrevocable trust. And so they sell their farm assets to that irrevocable trust. They retain an income stream. And then when the beneficiary of the grantor trust passes away, it goes into a separate stewardship trust. So again, we are still able to accomplish a freeze technique in order to minimize estate taxes to do that. Another way that we've been able to kind of protect the farming or ranching assets is that when the clients have created an LLC or want to create an LLC, they can include strict buy-sell restrictions and voting requirements that really limit the ability to sell the assets. In some of those cases where if there are multiple owners of the businesses, the farming business, where you've got, 2 or 3 kids who are owners and one wants to implement the stewardship trust, using that LLC where the others are the members, using the buy-sell restrictions is a great way to really keep the client's intent of preserving the property and put limitations on the ability to sell.
Yeah, so in any given context, we might be using 3 of these tools to make sure that the intent's accomplished.
All right, and then the next slide. So we just kind of wanted to give you just a 1-page brief summary of kind of general requirements for the Oregon Stewardship Trust. So there's got to be a stated purpose, which we've indicated. There's 3 categories of fiduciaries, and it can be perpetual. And then within that, the 3 categories of the fiduciary are the trust enforcer, the trustee, and the stewardship committee, which we're going to go into in more detail. And then also with regard to the beneficiaries, you don't have to have beneficiaries. As we've indicated, it can be generic. You can name classes. It can be to trusts or charities. I do have a client who is naming their private foundation as the beneficiary of the stewardship trust. And in that case, because of the private foundation rules, the private foundation can only receive income distributions. It can't receive principal distributions from the trust. Otherwise, it's going to cause excise taxes with the private foundation. But it's going to suit their purposes because they want the income to be going to the private foundation to support their charitable goals. Okay, Maria, if you want to go on in the next one, talk about the trust enforcer.
Since these are new roles that a lot of you probably haven't dealt with in other contexts because they were just made up when they did the stewardship statute, when I'm explaining it to clients, I try to think of it as like if you were in a business, what are the different roles in a business and how do they all function together? And so if we look back at the different roles, you've got the trust enforcer, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Think of that as like the IRS or like the compliance officer, the government, making sure that you're following the rules, right? And then you've got your trustee, who's like your CEO. And then you've got your stewardship committee, who's like your board of directors. And then you've got your beneficiaries, who are like your shareholders. So if you're trying to compare it to like a for-profit enterprise, that's how you would be thinking about it. At least that's how I think about it. I'm open to other suggestions if you guys can think of another way to do it or to compare it to. So the trust enforcer is really the person in the wings who ideally would be attending meetings of the stewardship committee, who's doing the day-to-day, making sure the trust purposes are being followed and the farm's making a profit and it's still being farmed the way they wanted it to be farmed. And this person is making sure that they're doing their job, basically. And in the very minimum, they would be checking once a year and looking at all of the trust reports and seeing that the money's being spent the way it's supposed to be spent and making sure that the trustee isn't off doing something crazy. So they're in the background. On the trust that I've done, the trust enforcer is usually more of a professional role. So it's somebody who has some expertise and would be able to handle understanding notices and financial reports and would know who to contact if there was something crazy going on with the stewardship committee or the trustee and be able to take action against that person. They are a fiduciary of the trust. And so it's usually someone who in their professional life is probably an accountant or an attorney or just somebody who has a lot of experience running a business, for example. So that's the trust enforcer. And then the other role here that's really important, which you guys are all familiar with, is the trustee. It's similar to a living trust where you have a trustee and they're making sure that the trust is distributing out the way it's supposed to. So they would be making the annual payments to the beneficiary. For example, if there's a charity that's the beneficiary, they'd make sure that they got the money out to them after the stewardship committee says this is how much we want to give them this year. And so they have the duty to inform and report to the trust enforcer. So your trust enforcer is kind of like your qualified beneficiary of a trust where they get an annual report and your trustee is saying, here you go, make sure I've done my numbers right. They are liable for bad faith or willful misconduct. So, I think of they're stealing money, they're going to be liable for that. But they're not liable if it's basic mistake because they relied on something that the trust enforcer or the stewardship committee gave them and it was incorrect. So those are the first two roles.
So as Maria indicated, the stewardship committee, I really liken that to the board of directors. They're making the big decisions and then the trustee is carrying those out. The stewardship committee has to have at least 3 persons serving as members of the committee. The trust agreement can provide for how the stewardship committee members get appointed and provide for succession of those, how vacancies are filled. They're always the statutory requirement is there has to be at least 3. The One of the advantages in the statute is that the trust can require a different vote from a majority vote and can grant a stewardship committee member to have more than one vote. So in one of my clients that we've established the stewardship trust for, they provided that one of the lineal descendants will always serve on the stewardship committee. And that if a lineal descendant is serving and they are of a certain age and have met certain educational requirements or have worked in the business, that they get more votes so that they'll have control on the stewardship committee. They can resign. They're not forced to serve, just like a trustee. They have to provide the reporting to the trustee and the enforcer, and they have the duty to keep them reasonably informed. You want to go to the next slide. And as I indicated, the trust agreement can modify the powers of the stewardship committee. So they can, the client can really decide what authority they want the stewardship committee to have. They're generally responsible for the, voting the interest or making decisions regarding the assets if you've directly deeded assets to the stewardship trust rather than a business entity. The stewardship committee basically does all of the things that a traditional trustee would do with regard to the power. So they have the power to decide if assets are going to be sold, if the stewardship committee, or excuse me, if the trust is going to make distributions to the beneficiaries, if the stewardship trust is going to buy assets. Those decisions are generally all made by the stewardship committee. The stewardship committee there includes provisions where if you've got a member of the stewardship committee who's running amok, there's the ability to remove and replace one of the members of the stewardship committee. And again, that can be modified by the terms of the trust agreement. So you may have the ability to, in the case where my client has included that a lineal descendant will always serve on the stewardship committee. We have provisions in there that if we have a lineal descendant who is not performing, that they can be removed for cause. And then that particular client has defined cause in their agreement. So there is flexibility. You're not stuck with them forever. Although the stewardship trust is generally irrevocable, it can be modified or it can be terminated. They do have to have, the statute requires the unanimous consent of all of the stewardship committee members and also the trust enforcer. So if this is not working, there is the ability to terminate it or modify it to meet the current provisions. The modification is not the same as the modification of other irrevocable trusts. The stewardship trust statute has specific provisions in it about how they are modified.
So there's, as you can probably tell, there's lots of ways you can set these up depending on how you want your committee arranged and your trustees and your trust enforcers. And the statute is really, in my opinion, open-ended about what these could be used for, whether it's really more charitable or more business-minded for profit. And there's not a lot of mandatory things that you have to do other than have those players at the table. And have a purpose for the trust, right? So it's a very scary thing maybe for some planners that it's wide open, right? You could plan all kinds of ways to use a stewardship trust to keep a legacy going for all kinds of purposes for family businesses and ranches and farms in Oregon. But that's also a very cool thing that we can do for our clients, is to be able to work with them and create a custom trust that they know will be their legacy. And so we talked a little bit already about a lot of these are created upon their passing instead of when they're alive. And that you just have to make sure you've dealt with any state tax issues on that. And then a lot of times they may want to start at least a portion of it during life. So my favorite ones is where they want to maybe just put like a 10% business interest for the farm into a stewardship trust now. And then they could even help run it, right, while they're still here, and make sure that it's all working well and that they have the team that's going to be the good team in place before they pass away. And because it's a lot easier to correct something that they don't like while they're still alive, and they could say, well, I'm going to buy that 10% back, for example, if it didn't work for whatever reason. When they set it up at death, it is a bit of a leap of faith that they've planned all of the ways around what they want for their farm, and they've got a really good team in place and a way to elect a new team when that team retires, and that it's going to continue on for a long, long time. So June, did you want to say anything more about either of these ones?
No, if you want to, we've already kind of talked about the, using it as an irrevocable gifting trust, the spousal trust. So if you want to go to the next slide, I talked a little bit already about the sale to the defective grantor trust, and then I'm sorry, Maria, go back one more slide. The trust with no ascertainable beneficiary. So that example is where they don't want it to benefit any specific person, or they want it to take care of their employees, or to have funds go to a charity, where basically then the business is managed to reinvest profits back into the business, into the farm, and minimize any financial return, so that there aren't going to be profits that get distributed, because it's all consumed within the business itself of paying out to employees. So if you want to go into, so we wanted to preserve a lot of time today for the case studies and really kind of talk with you about some specific examples so you can see how we've used this with clients. So Maria, you want to talk about our first farm family?
Sure. So this first one is the too big to manage the farm and the charitable goals, where it was kind of the perfect combination of both. And this took a long time to do the planning. So it's not like your nuts and bolts AB trust that you get it done in a few meetings and they go on their merry way. This probably took, I would say, 6 to 12 months by the time we really had honed in on what they wanted and how to create this. So this is a large farm family in Oregon that we set up a stewardship trust for at death. They went ahead and did the spousal trust during life to get the assets out of their estate and make sure that they're still provided for as long as they're alive. And then at death, the stewardship trust comes into being. And the stewardship trust is an irrevocable trust where they picked a committee that, it was very interesting. They picked on their committee an accountant, and then 2 farm managers or close family friends, and a family member. So they had a little bit larger committee, and then they had a trust enforcer. They found an attorney to do that. And then they named trustees that they thought would be, that they knew that they thought would be able to perform the duties of a trustee. Their whole goal was to continue the farm and grow the farm and the operations as the family legacy, but also to provide opportunities for people outside the family to manage the farm and farm on it, and also to provide to charitable interests that they had. And so they didn't give all of their farm to the stewardship trust. They gave a portion of it to family, but they felt like just the size of their farm would have been too much, practically speaking, for the family members that they had to be able to manage it. Because as you guys know, when you're planning with farm families, sometimes they really want to give it to the farm child, but that person maybe doesn't have what it takes to be able to keep it going successfully. They might be really good at growing the crops, or they might be really good at the business side, but successful farmers have that special combo of both of those things. And so sometimes that doesn't translate. a lot of farmers that I've worked with, it seems like they start at these little farms, and then by the time they're done, they've just grown it because they have that special combo of being able to turn a profit and farm, and they know how to make it all work. And so they felt like for the bulk of the farm, it would be better to have experienced people that they knew, making sure that it continued to be a profitable enterprise and to protect their family, not just the farm child, but the other family members who didn't farm, and give them some kind of income from it over time. And then also in this case, they had very specific charities that they've helped throughout their life, and they want to continue helping forever, which is a pretty cool thing. And so they made sure that when they framed in what's the committee going to do, they had very specific things where they wanted to make sure that the farm never had to have an operating loan. So they had a very conservative fiscal idea that they always have a year ahead at least, in cash that will stay in the trust. And that way they'll never, even in a down year, they would be okay and the trust could continue. They also were interesting in that giving out money to the charities and the family was secondary to reinvesting it into equipment in the farm, maybe buying more land, things like that. They did give some advantages to the descendants that might farm some of the land that the farm trust or the stewardship trust, owns. And so they had very specific things that they wanted to do. And I put together a couple of materials that we worked on just so you could see the thought process of what we went through to try to frame all of this in. And so they here you can see that they really wanted somebody on the stewardship committee that understands agricultural real estate investments, and they really wanted someone who was a farm manager and someone who's in finance. So in their committee, they're always going to have the different strengths to make sure that it doesn't fail, right? And then they wanted to make sure that the trust enforcer and the stewardship committee didn't just have farm experience, but they had broader board experience as well, and that they had experience in at least a couple of these things. So not everybody had to have every aspect of this, because that'd be hard to find. But like if for example, the finance person that's on the stewardship committee, they needed to have a lot of experience with dealing with profit and loss and dealing with maybe for-profit board experience, for example. And maybe the farm manager is the one that has experience with their own multi-generational farm businesses, or their own real estate investments in ag, or their own farm operations. So they really, I thought, did a wonderful job of exploring what they really want and what are the qualifications for a committee who could make this thing continue. And then we did a unique thing where we all met at the farm with the committee, with the trust enforcer, with the trustee, and said, hey, this is coming down the pike. Are you guys on board with this? What questions do you have? And everybody had buy-in on it. They're looking forward to it. And in this case, they're responsible for finding their successor too. And so like the CPA would find another CPA to replace them, and so on and so forth. So they had characteristics that they thought overall were really important to being in any of these roles, and that was really understanding business and just being a good person who could listen and have good communication skills. Some of the things seem like no-brainers, but I think it was good that they put that actually into an exhibit saying, these are qualifications we want you guys to think about before you appoint somebody else. And then, so for this as well, they had a mission statement and a purpose. And so they really wanted to have the perpetual maintenance of ag land in Oregon. I mean, they just have a love of the land, and they also wanted to help out, Oregon charities and their family while protecting the farmland. And so they developed their vision that it would continue to be productive ag property, and their purpose was to protect the farmland and the charities and the descendants that they have identified for as long as they can. And then one interesting position that they have is they want to continue to grow it. So it's a big farm now, but I think they were the philosophy of you grow or die kind of thing, which we've seen a lot with farming, where a lot of the smaller folks just can't afford the big equipment. And it's economies of scale where your profit margins are slimmer. And so you need to keep growing in order to keep it economically viable. And I think they were very conscious of that. So that's my example of the family that, one of the families that has done the Farm Stewardship Trust. And June, I think you have a very different example to go through next.
Yeah, so the other one that I have, I'm gonna call it the Take Care of My Guys plan, which we followed a lot of this similar issues, except in their situation, the mom and dad own, it's a farming and processing. So they have a significant number of employees, and mom and dad have kids, and none of the kids are involved in the farming or processing business. And mom and dad actually don't want to have any part of the economic benefit of the farming and processing go to their children. So we are working on, they haven't signed the stewardship trust agreement yet. We're getting ready to do that in a couple weeks, but they are using the stewardship trust example of having all of the assets being put into the stewardship trust. They're going to make lifetime gifts now to transfer up to their federal exclusion amount of their ownership interest in that. And then the rest will go when they pass away. And the stewardship trust is not going to have really any beneficiaries. The goal for and the purpose of their stewardship trust is that to manage the business, to minimize profits so that it is put back into their employee benefit plans, or reinvesting in the business and growing the business. They do not want really distributions to come out. If there will be distributions that come out of the trust, they've identified that it'll be their key executives who will be the pool of beneficiaries for that, so that they'll get, some or potentially some distributions, but their plan really is that the profits, instead of being distributed to an owner, are going to be paid out to their employees, and keep it going in perpetuity. So it's a very different kind of model where they don't want their kids to benefit at all, and actually have written their kids out of the plan completely, of their estate plan. But that can also work for clients who don't have any children, and don't have a next generation at all, where it can be put back into that.
So then this is kind of a fun example that I did, I think it was in 2021, where this was a very different idea of a farm than your traditional farm. Okay, so this client has an eco village. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that, but it is a thing in Oregon, where it's essentially a farm that has multiple buildings and living quarters, and members of the eco village can live there and live off of the land, so to speak. So they have to work a certain amount of time on the farm, and then they don't have to pay to live there. So it fit the stewardship model weirdly well, because this client's goal was to make this eco village continue after they're gone, and they wanted to make sure that they could have up to, I think it was up to 30 people that could be in the eco village at any given time and live there. And so it's a totally different model than my more traditional farmer, who was working towards, you have a farm manager on your committee, and you have a CPA on your committee, and you've got all of these kind of semi-professionals in the farm field or in the professional field on the committee running this trust. In this case, the stewardship committee is just members of the eco village. So they're from all walks of life. So they could be college professors, or they could be day laborers, or they could be an electrician. And they, as long as they meet the requirements to be an Eco Village member, then they can be elected onto the stewardship committee. And so they, the goal was just to have an Eco Village that can keep going for many generations of organic farmers who want that way of life. So I kind of think of it as like the old commune. I guess that was before my time, you know, but I think of California commune, that kind of thing. But this is something that people are doing today. And I just did a quick Google search before this because I hadn't thought about this file in a little while, or this client in a little while. And there's actually a bunch of Eco Villages. So it seems like to be a more popular thing these days. So Nellie, I don't know, we're at 12:45 now. Should we stop with the examples and answer questions?
We can do that. I did not see any questions in the chat yet, but folks can please feel free to enter those. There was a comment that pet trusts also do have trust enforcers from Donna.
Oh, yeah.
So that was in there, and then folks had asked for the materials, and I just let someone know that I'll be getting those out to you, I hope tomorrow. And I'll include a link to the recording too, so that everybody can access that. Yeah, I think we can open it up to questions if folks want to unmute or type anything in chat.
And if there aren't a lot of questions, we have lots more examples. So, but we'll leave it open for a minute here and see if anybody's going to.
Nellie, this is Fred Schroeder. And I think this point was made earlier. And while you guys are certainly presenting stewardship trust from the idea of ranches, but there's nothing that restricts it to strictly an agricultural use.
Right.
It kind of makes me think of clients that want to keep the vacation rental in the family forever. It's a purpose. You have beneficiaries. You could set it all up. So I don't see, do you see any restrictions on how our stewardship trust could be used?
No, and that's one of the big advantages of the stewardship trust is that it's not limited to a business purpose, and you can have economic and non-economic interest, and there's no restrictions on what types of assets the stewardship trust can hold as far as what's in the stewardship trust statute, right? So it's very broad, and I've actually used it kind of as an example in a non-farming entity. Is I have a client who has inherited stock from the family bank that went public, and so they use the stewardship trust and looking at it to preserve that stock for actually, and these clients are in their mid 40s and have, you know, school age children, and they're thinking that we don't need this, our kids aren't going to need it, so we want this set up for our grandkids and great grandkids and managing it then. So basically we use the stewardship trust to put the stock in there and hold the family bank stock, knowing that it's not going to benefit, you know, their immediate family members. It's for future family members. So there's a lot of flexibility in what you can use them for, and what they are, what assets they own. One of our former partners, you know, we were looking at this, was thinking it could only be certain types of assets, but the statute doesn't have any restrictions in it.
And
on that example, or sorry, I was going to just, on that example of the bank trust, if I understood correctly, some of the other comments, when your clients put that bank stock into the stewardship trust, they're making a present day gift using part of their federal exemption. Okay.
Yes. Right. Yeah. And that was a primary reason for doing it, is they're looking at, you know, getting that out while we have a really high federal exclusion amount right now, and taking advantage of that to get that asset out of their estate. They're also Oregon residents, so they're looking at, you know, making that lifetime gift to minimize their Oregon estate tax.
Gotcha.
And you could use it in the context of family legacies. my long farm example was really where there was multiple types of beneficiaries they wanted to help, but I've definitely also done it where they just want to avoid the rule against perpetuities. And they want to make sure that this is going to be this, 5th generation ranch is going to be a 10th generation ranch. So without ever having it, have the estate tax issues.
Yeah, on your example, so I have a client who has they refer to it as the compound. And because it's got a huge, house, it is an operating ranch, but they also lease out part of it for events. And so we're discussing with them doing a stewardship trust, and all the funds go to support it. There really aren't any profits that get distributed because the cost of maintaining it is not insignificant. And so we're looking at a stewardship trust for that, to keep it in the family and keep it operating.
Well, and in the ones that I've done, we always put some liquid assets in with whatever the farm assets or other assets are, just as an emergency fund in case it had a bad year.
Mhm.
Other questions?
I'm not seeing any. Maybe if you want to go over a couple of your other slides or a couple other examples.
Yeah.
And
You want me to talk about my example of using it as succession planning until the kids are old enough? So I have a client that we've put in place the stewardship trust. The second generation is currently owners and operating the business. First generation still has a very small ownership percentage. And there's 2 second generation family members. One is involved, one is not involved. The concern is that their kids are still they're all under 18, and they're looking at who is going to manage if something happens to me in the interim, and how is this going to continue to operate. And then also they have a significant both G2s have a significant philanthropic and goal, and also want to benefit their community and keep the farm operating. So we've used the stewardship trust for that, to put in some professional management so that they don't have a traditional trustee who's managing for the benefit of the beneficiaries, that they can use the stewardship trust model to allow them to keep the farm in operations. And there may not be distributions to the kids, and they're okay with that, but it allows for the kids to eventually come in if they want to in the future, but it will keep the farm in continued operations. And then to the extent that they do have profits, it can either be distributed to the beneficiaries or it can go to charitable beneficiaries as well. So it's been a nice solution for them of they're not sure yet, and need kind of interim management.
And I can do one more example that was a little different than the big one. So this one was a more modest farm, and the person was married, but it was a blended family situation. And so it was a later in life blended family situation. And so the client loved his farm. I mean, it was everything, right? Well, aside from his wife, I'm sure, but he loved her too. But he wanted to make sure that she would be protected, but have no ability whatsoever to mess with, his first love of the farm that he'd had his whole life. And she was totally on board with it. So it was very interesting because she was actually the one that's saying, I really want you to protect this, because she just recognized how important it was for him. So we were able to use a stewardship trust so that she can continue to live there for her life and receive income from it for her life. But none of his kids wanted to farm, and none of her kids were farmers. And they had some nieces and nephews that might want to farm, but it wasn't really a sure thing at this point. And so they had good options for like a committee of people that could make sure it continued to run. And one interesting thing is he had a longtime farm manager that he really wanted to benefit, because the person had been with him for, I don't know, 20 years or something. And now that person's kids were kind of coming up and wanting to come onto the farm and manage it. And so he did the stewardship trust where it'll benefit relatives, but also the farm manager and anybody who's worked there for at least, I think we said 10 years, so that it would be kind of taking care of the employees as well and making sure that it stayed a farm. And I just thought it was a cool plan because he was willing to do the work to do that. And the wife fully recognized that this wasn't her love of her life, but that it was his, and that she wanted to support that. And so as far as the estate taxes on that one, I think the farm was maybe, I don't remember the value of the farm, but it was, I would say, under 5 million. And so there would be estate taxes because it's not going to spouse or under the farm exemptions for Oregon. And so in that case, he just set aside liquid assets and plans to have the estate tax paid, because that was the way he wanted to do it. He didn't want to give up control during life. And so that's another kind of outside the box way that this came into play, but it fit those. If you go back and think about our initial discussion of when do you start thinking about farm trust might be right, it fit that love of the land and not having quite the right mix of people who could manage the farm long term. So that was another one that I've done.
Let's see, do we have time for another one? Are we at, or any other questions on that?
I might just add for context, like one of the reasons why so many farms are looking at stewardship trusts, in part, organically grown company was the major driver behind the legislation. And they're not a co-op, they were a B Corp, and now they are owned under a pretty complex stewardship trust model. But they, and I think a lot of the original growers under that company had been very interested in seeing their original purposes for the business not being circumvented in, you know, a sale or a merger or anything that could come down the line. So they did that for a large distribution company. But then a lot of their farmer members have been thinking about it for their own businesses.
Mm-hmm. It can be a very elegant solution for the right circumstances. And what's really great about the statute is so flexible that we can really use it to tailor to the client's goals.
Okay. So that's all I had for today. June, did you have any more that?
Nope, that was it. Thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like I said, I'll be reaching back to everyone. Oops, there's one last question. Could it be structured in a manner that allows the equipment to flow into the trust after they get a step up in basis?
Yes, the issue with that then is that it's a testamentary transfer to the stewardship trust rather than a lifetime transfer, and the assets in there will be the equipment or whatever assets will be in their estate and subject to estate tax. But as for Maria's example of, yeah, that was an important consideration for her client to maintain control, and was willing to pay the estate tax in order to have that.
And to get the step up.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And thank you both for answering that. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And I will be registering you for your CLEs. Feel free to reach out to me. For if I don't have your bar number, if you didn't register through the bar, and I'll be reaching out to you with the recording and the materials. But Maria, June, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and these great stories. It's very inspirational.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.